This is TWIS. This Week in Science, episode number 867, recorded on Wednesday, March 16th, 2022. When Irish pie are smiling. I'm Dr. Kiki, and today we will fill your head on This Week in Science with homeopathy, jockeys, and a winning mindset. But first, thanks to our amazing Patreon sponsors for their generous support of TWIS. You can become a part of the Patreon community at patreon.com/thisweekinscience.
Disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. No, daylight savings time did not turn me into Justin. Instead, I am going to read his disclaimer, having never read it before. Here we go. Disclaimer, disclaimer, disclaimer. Of all the things in nature, there are few as perfectly constructed as an egg. Which egg I am referring to doesn't much matter. But picture, if you must, the egg of a chicken. It has a protective shell, able to withstand the weight of a chicken resting upon it. Within the egg is perhaps the very meaning of life explained. Inside are all the ingredients needed. The nutrient building blocks, the instructions of DNA, and eventually a fully formed baby chicken will be living in there, free from the worries of the outside world. Unconnected, self-sustained, and perfectly happy in its little egg world, until it's time to break out of its shell and get on with being a chicken. Sent out of the egg life with one overriding mission: make more eggs. People have pondered the question of which came first, chicken or egg. The answer is egg. Egg came first. Chickens are less than 60,000 years old, a relative newcomer to being a species. Dinosaurs, lizards, amphibians all had eggs long before there were birds, let alone chickens. The first mammals were likely egg layers too, hundreds of millions of years before any of these. Fish were laying eggs. But that's the genius of eggs. Fish, dinosaur, turtle, chicken, it doesn't matter to an egg. To an egg, everything is about eggs. Every niche of the food web and each adaptation of evolution, the structure of the genome, and every instinct of every life form upon the planet, all just strategies towards making more eggs, and more episodes of This Week in Science coming up next.
I've got the kind of mind that can't get enough. I want to learn everything. I want to fill it all up with new discoveries that happen every day of the week. There's only one place to go to find the knowledge I seek. I want to know what's happening. What's happening? What's happening this week in science? What's happening? What's happening? What's happening this week in science?
Good science to you, Kiki.
And a good science to you too, Blair. Welcome everyone out there to another episode of This Week in Science. We are back. Well, 2/3 of us are back at this very moment in time, thanks to the changing of the clocks, the changing of the time guard, the rising of the sun. Well, it always it rises and sets. We're in a solar system. We're going round and round, and we're spinning. It's just going to happen. And as humans, we will debate. But there is no debate on this show about the weekly science that we like to enjoy. We like to discuss. We like to enjoy. And let's see, I have stories this week about eggs. Single eggs, very important eggs. We'll talk about those eggs. Cells and mouse perceptions. Yes, mouse perceptions. What did you bring, Blair?
Oh, I have jockeys. I have sea turtles. I have smelly birds, and of course, elephant tusks.
Of course you have elephant tusks. No, you would never have elephant tusks unless it were just a story.
Yeah.
All right. And as we jump into the show here, I want to remind you that if you are not yet subscribed to This Week in Science, you can find us as a podcast on all the podcast directories, pretty much where podcasts are found. Look for This Week in Science. And we broadcast weekly live on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitch. We are TWIS Science on Twitch, Twitter, and Instagram. If all this naming and citing and mediaing is hurting your head, just go to TWIS.org. That's our website where we post show notes and links and all sorts of fun things.
Yeah,
But
just go there,
now,
start clicking things. You'll find some good stuff.
just click the things. You'll find the stuff as you click around.
Yeah.
Oh. And it looks as though we have a just woken up Justin joining the show. Hello.
Hey, did y'all have that daylight savings time thing happen over there?
We
'Cause
did.
It's not the same.
Yeah.
A
It's
little
not
bit different.
a global thing.
Mm.
I've got a story that I really am excited about leading off on, especially following Justin's disclaimer about eggs, what the egg wants, what the egg needs. Well, in this story, it's about researchers figuring out what an egg wants in order to, I guess, not have to have a sperm involved. So there is a form of reproduction called parthenogenic reproduction, and we have found it in lots of species other than mammals. And the question is, why don't mammals reproduce parthenogenically? Parthenogenic reproduction is when females of a species they go, I'm going to have a baby now. And they just have an egg,
It's
and that
just
egg is
egg.
able to divide. Just egg.
Eggs,
Nothing
just
else.
egg. Eggs. I
Just
don't
egg. And
need
so
anything
what's
else.
crazy
I don't need
about
anything.
it is that you essentially have a duplicate genome. Instead of having half from mom, half from dad, you just get the egg and it just replicates. It divides and
It divides.
It works off of it. And so my favorite thing about parthenogenesis is depending on what animal is doing it and how their sex chromosomes work, you either end up with all boys or all girls.
That is fascinating. That is very interesting. Well,
Yeah.
researchers just published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences their work in which they used CRISPR to edit the genes of the egg from a mouse so that it mimicked what would happen if a sperm had been contributed during fertilization. But fertilization didn't happen. They just CRISPR'd the egg, made it think it had been fertilized by a sperm, and they injected an enzyme into it to get some things kicked off, as enzymes tend to do, catalyze reactions. And they implanted it into a female mouse's uterus, and it grew. They did this a number of times, and they resulted in a large number of viable offspring. So they had 227 reconstructed oocytes. They had 192 of those oocytes developed to the blastocyst stage. Blastocyst is when that little ball of cells after fertilization decides to start really dividing. They transferred all 192 blastocysts into the embryos of females. There were 14 pregnancies. 3 of them resulted in live pups, and they had 1 survive to adulthood, also to reproduce itself.
Wow.
Okay,
So
but
actually successful adult, not just lived and died, but reproduced.
So this ratio is terrible, though. It's not a very
Oh.
good success rate, and it's also this is my question: why on earth would you want this? Because let me follow up. Exactly the thing I mentioned. You end up with a duplicate of genes, right? And so that is exactly why inbreeding is bad, and you end up with detrimental mutations and high mortality rates and all sorts of diseases popping up in the offspring of inbreeding, right? And so that is exactly the issue with parthenogenesis, is you end up with a higher propensity of mortality, of all sorts of diseases. So why would you want to use CRISPR to make parthenogenesis happen in mammals?
The
Just to see if you
idea is
can?
that if you only have a female of a species left, you could potentially help to perpetuate that species, maybe not forever, but it could kickstart things. It would be a severe population bottleneck, genetic bottleneck. But it could be used in zoos. It could be used in the conservation of species. It could also be used in situations in which humans want to have a child but don't want to have a sperm involved. Or maybe there are situations in which maybe the male partner or the sperm that would be contributed to an offspring does have a known genetic mutation that is a problem. And the woman in the relationship, the female, the person with the egg, doesn't want to bring that genetic mutation into the situation. They know that they have great genes. Why don't I just use my great genes?
No.
I can see all
This
sorts
is-
of reasons or ways that it could be
Oh,
useful. It's
man.
not going to be humanity being taken over by parthenogenic reproduction because it doesn't make sense, but there are examples in which it could be useful.
I think it
and you
only
left one
makes
out.
sense if it's
You
going to
left one
be
out.
to
Big one.
like stop extinction, because I feel like it's a huge risk. It's a huge I feel like there's a huge ethical issue with trying to do this intentionally, because diversifying genes makes a healthier offspring, and you're basically welcoming all sorts of problems.
What was the
Wow.
reason that we
Yeah,
left
go
out,
ahead.
Justin?
Yeah, go, Justin.
Oh, it's exactly what you were saying. All the problems that could come from attempting to create monotheism in mice.
Yeah. Oh. Yeah, this really makes me feel uncomfortable, because I understand why people would think it's a good idea who don't have a deep understanding of the genetic fallout from making this choice, right? Like, so I know we're very far away from that. We just made one mouse, but like, it's oof. There's also part of it. Is this even better? Is this
No,
this
it's
better
not.
for preventing
It's not.
extinction if you're going to end up with animals that don't live very long, or it's all of these issues. I don't
Right.
know.
I mean, part of it does help us, the research itself does help us understand. Okay, we didn't understand why mammals weren't able to reproduce parthenogenically previously. Now we do know it has to do with epigenetic imprinting, and it is this imprinting that occurs during fertilization that usually happens that keeps an egg. Sorry. It is the imprinting that happens that causes an egg to not be able to divide itself in mammals. And so the sperm is part of knocking out those uh those markers that keep the egg from starting to divide and doing stuff. And so now we understand a bit more about how the process works. So scientifically, this is great for potentially working in fertility for
Mhm.
humans and lots of other species, even if we never use parthenogenesis ourselves.
Okay. All right,
The
I'm on board.
understanding is important.
Okay. You convinced me. This
Okay.
research makes sense. I still don't want mammals via parthenogenesis. I think it's a very bad idea. But I
Your
think that
rhinos? What about your rhinos?
they would last only a few generations, probably, with all the issues. It's definitely
So I
But like
would
you said-
100% use that as a resort for rhinos. Absolutely. Yeah.
And you said,
You got
Blair,
it. You're talking about last line of defense here.
and you said no in the species that do reproduce in this way, where the egg just divides and copies itself. Sometimes it ends up with all females. Sometimes it
yeah.
ends up with all males. So you could
So if you did mammals, you'd
bifurcate.
only get females, because you'd only get XX and YY. So
Right.
YY is non-viable, so you'd only end up with female offspring.
Got it. Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, that is
Anyway.
interesting because most of
Anyway,
the famous
we can do it now.
Never mind.
Yeah. Let's move on.
All right. Who's next on the science stories? Justin, do you have something?
I got some. Just when you thought it was safe to go outside again, volcanoes, and not just your, the volcanoes you grew up with either. We're talking post COVID, pre World War III era type volcanoes. University of Copenhagen physicists studied ancient ice from cores drilled out of Antarctica and Greenland, so bipolar there. Associate Professor Anders Svensson of the University of Copenhagen, Niels Bohr Institute, and associates were able to look back over 60,000 years of the ice core, longer than there have been chickens. They were able to look 60,000 years of history, and they were able to piece together that history and magnitude of volcanic activity. They were even able, in some cases, I think on 70, 80, a whole bunch of times, they were able to actually match up. 85 times, they're actually able to match up the same volcanic activity that affected both poles. So those are really big global affects. So what did this tell them? What did they learn? Well, research revealed that some really gigantic volcanic eruptions have taken place in the past. 69 eruptions were bigger than any in modern history. If you don't remember the largest volcanic eruption in our modern history, why would you? It was over 200 years ago. It took place in Indonesia's Mount Tambora, 1815. That eruption blocked out the sun, caused tsunamis, drought, famine, caused global cooling. In the years that followed, 80,000 people died, but that was in 1815 people numbers. Back then, there were only 1 billion people on the planet. Today, humans, that number would be about 640,000. Or as COVID likes to call it, a good start. All right. 60,000 years, 69 eruptions, 69 enormous volcano eruptions, bigger than Mount Tambora. Three of them were in a category of their own, larger than the other 66. So this is quoting Anders Svensson. The new 60,000-year timeline of volcanic eruptions supplies us with better statistics than ever before. Now we can see that many more of these great eruptions occurred during the prehistoric ice age than in modern times. Because large eruptions are relatively rare, a long timeline is needed to know when they occur, and that's what we now have. We can expect more at some point, but we just don't know if that will be in 100 years or a few thousand. Tambora-sized eruptions appear to erupt once or twice every 1,000 years, so the wait may be shorter. They did see a connection between volcanic eruptions and global climate, where post big eruptions, global eruptions, there was a 5 to 10 year cooling period at the global scale. 85 of the eruptions they identified were observed by researchers at both of the poles. 25 of these were larger than any eruption in the past 2,500 years, while 69 were larger than the 1815 Tambora eruption. And the largest eruption on record which was the largest in the last 500 years. But you know it's going to happen now, right? Like,
what?
this is right. Like, it's going to be COVID, World War III, and
Yeah.
super volcanoes.
Little
And an
volcano.
earthquake, tsunami, just do it all.
The 7.3 off the
aside
coast
from
of
the
Tokyo
drought
was good.
and the famine and the tsunamis and all the massive death,
Yeah.
compared to COVID numbers, really nothing.
Yeah.
Right? We
Nothing.
can handle
Walk in the
that.
park.
Hey, 5 to 10 years of global cooling wouldn't be such a bad thing. Silver lining.
Right,
People might
the
even
global
think
cooling
about
aspect
starting
of
one of
super
these.
volcano. Yeah, sure.
For some things,
might-
but there would be like, die-offs from not as much sun and,
Not
and
enough
also
food.
and
Yeah.
plants and
Yeah,
animals
yeah.
dying because of the cold snap that
yeah.
happens super fast.
Yeah.
And,
But silver lining,
Yeah,
last
yeah,
line
yeah.
of defense. We'll save this one. We'll make this like the parthenogenesis for the species. We'll save this one for last. But
Okay,
just
so
writing
things
an action
we're putting
movie
on the
now.
list for how to save the planet: parthenogenesis and volcanoes.
Yeah.
Super
we sound
volcanic.
like supervillains now. No, we don't. It's like, no, I was trying to save the planet by firing my laser into the volcano to make it.
Yeah.
No, you guys don't understand. I'm helping.
Blair, tell us
Yes.
how we're gonna win the race.
Yes. Well, it turns out it doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman.
Great.
Wait, what? Say
University
that
of
again?
Nottingham has done a study to figure out if
Wait,
it
wait.
matters if a jockey is a man or a woman. Because
Oh,
this is
and
what
writing
we
a different
need
athlete. Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
science for, I guess.
Yeah.
Apparently there is a huge expectation in the horse racing world that male jockeys are stronger, they're able to push the horses harder, and they thus perform better in races than female jockeys. More than 90% of jockeys in most racing nations are men. I thought it was like basketball or something like that where it was a men's league. I assumed because I had only ever seen male jockeys. No, women and men
There
can
are
both
female
be
jockeys.
jockeys. I didn't know that, but it turns out the reason I didn't know that is because 90% of them are men.
Yep, exactly.
And so there's
Actually, I'm
this,
surprised it's not even more than that, but yeah.
yeah, so there's this baked in unconscious bias that men are going to be better at this. And so there was a study to look at the effect of sex of a rider on racehorse performance and physiology during training. And they found this is only possible because, to your point, Justin, there was a marked increase in participation of female jockeys in the last decade. And so it's only at 90% now because there have been way more in the last 10 years than there ever have been before. And so they were able to look at 530 thoroughbred racehorses ridden by 103 different riders, 66 male, 37 female, at a total of 3,568 workouts at a single racing yard in Australia. They looked at speed, stride length, frequency, horses' heart rate, rate of recovery. They recorded all these things with a fitness tracker, and they found no effect of the sex of the jockey on any objectively measured outcome variable. Then they looked at 52,464 races and found that female jockeys had a very similar win percentage to male jockeys, 10.7% female versus 11.3% male. So they found a minimal effect of the sex of the jockey on both training and race outcomes. So I'm not surprised to hear about this. I'm not bringing this because this is breakthrough science. I bring it because this is a really good example of using science to just do a comprehensive look at why we have certain expectations and whether they're based in any fact. And guess what? It's not.
So if this was almost any other athletic competition, I would have objected and said, no, it's definitely meant. Like, you shouldn't, like, there's a reason why you have sex divided sports. And this is a whole slippery slope, and that people are like, oh, but then how are you defining sex and everything else? I'll just say, if you were born a woman, don't get into a fighting ring with a born a man.
I don't
It's
know.
no,
depends.
Justin, maybe we need some studies to figure this
No,
out.
we
No,
don't
we
need
need
some
studies.
studies.
They've
I mean-
actually tried it. They've actually tried it in fighting events before. It's the
Of
worst
men and
thing
women
you've
who
ever
are the
seen.
same size, who are like the featherweight or the welterweights.
The
or,
top
yeah.
woman with the like middle trained average Joe fighter guy. They've done it in boxing. They've done it in kickboxing. They've done it in mixed martial. It ends very badly, and it should never be done again because it looks like domestic abuse. It looks horrible, and I'm not kidding.
Okay,
There's certain
fine.
Okay, you can look it up. We can talk about it
Fine.
later.
But I'm just
But-
wondering if they've have done this, like you're saying, within the sport. But I mean, you don't want like a 5 foot not person up against a 7 foot tall
And they have weight classes too. They do have
I
weight
know
classes
they have weight
too.
classes, and that would be part of
But-
and that should be part of the determination. But that's not what this is about necessarily.
Right.
This is
No.
somebody
But
who
this
sits
is
on
in
a
way
horse,
because actually it is to your point,
and it's very specifically weight and leg
actually
strength.
very very specifically to your point. Yeah, what you're saying though. In a way, I never thought about it. Like, it is a weight class. if you can get down to the weight class of, what is it, a 10-year-old boy? I'm not even sure. They're very small. You have to be very slight to be a jockey. You can't be a grown average person.
So
You just can't.
jockeys, just so you know, since this is kind of what you're asking about, they're
Yeah.
weighed in before and after races, and there is a handicap based on weight. So the race is adjusted for the weight of the jockey, and this study was also adjusted for so they took that variable away, right? And so this is something somebody asked in the chat room: isn't a lighter jockey more likely to win? And sometimes depends. There's a lot of actual kind of skill that goes into kind of steering the horse and pacing the horse and all these sorts of things. So there's other things that go into it, but yes. And so you might expect that a woman might actually do better than a man because overall they might weigh less, right? But they're adjusting for that variable, right? So that variable is not it. We're not asking who weighs less, who weighs down the horse more, right? We are asking all other variables erased from the equation, who is doing the best job as a jockey, and it's equal. And I understand what you're saying, Justin, and I understand that that may be true. I also know that there part of it is optics, so you might be foreseeing something because of expectations of how something looks, and that's one of the things that you mentioned, right? And so I also just challenge that this is an excellent opportunity to use data to actually look at what's happening in a space, because
Yes.
the way that something looks might impose a narrative that may or may not be supported by the data involved. So I'm just going to leave it at
What are
that.
you talking about? Because I got confused. So, but my point was that I would think it would actually be easier for females to get into or to have that
To be
weight
jockeys.
class and
Right.
that jockey thing. So, and I mean, I'm envisioning a 90% female if their interest is there, because there should be more candidates that fit the weight class. There just should be the size and weight class. It's sort of like,
Is not what is, and the
yeah. It's
science
sort of like when
is what we're
they
seeing.
went
Yeah.
to that cave where they discovered Homo naledi, and they were putting out the request for slight build, archaeologists, preferably with spelunking ability. And I think it was something
To
like
fit into the
under
cave because
5'1".
they had to be tiny. Yeah.
Yeah, they ended
Yeah.
up with an all-female crew, and I think it's just by the numbers, it's just how things work, right?
Well,
They just
except
had
culture
more.
comes into who ends up being a jockey, and that is a male-dominated culture up to this point. So that also is going to impact who's going to go into training for the sport. There's a lot going on. I just wanted to bring this story to talk about the fact that it might be worth bringing some data to these preconceptions.
I'm glad you did, because I don't know how I would have put my foot in my mouth without talking about gender equality if you hadn't brought that story.
Yeah. No, believe it or not, that was not the reason I brought it. But here we are.
Oh, here we are. And you know where we are? We are in this wonderful place in time where we have sent an optical space telescope out to a Lagrange point, and we didn't know whether it was going to be able to get past its 300 some odd challenges of things to fail. And NASA just released the first image from the Webb Space Telescope. They have successfully aligned all of the mirrors in the telescope, and this image they released is what they say it's like the best you can possibly get from a telescope this size. Highest resolution image, highest fidelity, highest focus. And the interesting aspect of this is it's focused down to basically like quantum levels. It's the diffraction limits of each of the mirrors coming together. And so the image itself has beautiful diffraction, and even galaxies that you can see in the foreground and background of the focus star that they chose are in focus. the galaxies around it are also in focus. So there is
Wow.
so much that is going to be seen from the space telescope when they're ready to really start doing science with it. And at the moment, it's not quite ready because there's still a couple more instruments that they have to calibrate with the mirrors to make everything work. But May, it sounds like May, they're really going to get going and be able to start looking off into the universe, which is
So
very exciting.
at least the picture that they've put up of this looks like a 1970s sci-fi lens flare.
It does.
Like, I saw that image and I'm like, wow, really? The thing you're trying to look at, you can't see it all. Really, it's just all lens flare all of it. It looks cool, but
Because it's a
I can't
star.
make
It's a
anything.
point source. It's a point source of light. But the
Yeah, I don't think that. I think that is that a little bit artistically image thingy, not a useful because it's yeah. I don't know.
It's all the stuff around it.
it's all the stuff around it that's
Oh, the
very
stuff
important.
around
That's
it
the
looks
interesting.
amazing.
Yeah, the stuff around it is the stuff that's very cool. The ability to be able to peer into the dust, because that's really what Webb is going to be so useful for. Not the light. It is an optical telescope, and yes, we're looking at light, but it's infrared that we're focused on. Infrared is going to be the heat, the spectra of heat in the universe, not just the light, the visible stuff, the rainbow spectrum that we love to look at. But yes, it's very exciting. It's very exciting.
Mhm.
Images to come. Technology for the win. Woohoo! Justin, tell me another story.
All right, it's time for that sporadically produced yet unyieldingly questionable segment of the show. Did we really need a study for that? Homeopathy edition. So there's very little evidence offered for homeopathy treatments, cures, immunizations. That said, occasionally there are randomized controlled trials performed. These aren't exactly studies, but they are trials where, this many people were given this microdose, I guess it would be, of something over this period of time to attempt to relieve XY condition. So scientists at Danube University Krems in Austria looked at a large sample of these trials. I think they ended up with 97 by the end. They started with a larger one and had to wean it down to the 97. Found that they lacked basic scientific methodology and were riddled with red flags. And this is in the way that the trials were sort of conducted and reported. The proper way to do a clinical trial is to register it. And there's many organizations that you can register with. There's a few really big ones. They're usually government or institutions. And so you register the details of the research you are about to do. And so here's the number of people involved. Here's our methods. Here's what we're testing. Here's how we will evaluate our outcomes. Here's the outcome that we're going to measure. That's a big important one. Here's the thing that we're going to, you don't just give somebody like a new drug or something and then we're just going to wait and see what happens. So we've given this drug to a number of people with different ailments and we're going to see if it cures one of them. That's not experimenting. That's guinea pigging, but that's not experimenting. If you're doing a trial, you should already know the outcome that you're looking for at that point. Okay. So part of the purpose of registering in advance is so that you follow through with publishing your results. You're saying, here's the study I'm going to do. You do the study and then you publish, regardless of the results. It's a sort of a way of creating level of credibility, but removing bias from publishing. Because you've already announced, here's the research I'm going to do, and you follow through with it, and you publish it. And people know, before they even did this study, before the outcome was there, they had already laid out how this study was going to proceed. That way, nobody can change the study if they get a different result, or just decide not to publish. Okay. Yeah. So important safeguard against, say, running 50 studies, 50 trials, and then only publishing the one where smoking hemlock looked like a really good treatment for whooping cough, which you shouldn't have had in the first place because there's vaccines for that. But okay, why bother when you can smoke hemlock to make it go away in one of 50 trials? Registering trials is important. That's my whole point. 38% of homeopathy trials were registered, so they did register, but were never published. So that's a big red flag. They ran the trial, they did the study, they got a result, and they decided not to publish that result. That's a red flag because why you would not publish
That's
it at that
cherry
point?
picking. But I mean, in science, very often negative results or null results are not published. Researchers tend not to publish them all the time. I mean, this happens all over the
And
place. We complain about
all
this all
sorts
the
of
time.
studies, but not in clinical trials. When they do a
Right.
a randomized clinical trial, a drug company will publish the result. It's like, this is their pipeline of, here's what we looked at, or here's what
Yeah.
we're going to look at. Then we looked at it, we got it. You hear this all the time. Oh, poor big pharma company XYZ, their trial for this to treat that didn't work. Didn't look good after all. Now the investors are dumping a stock. Okay, whatever. Hear about this all the time. So 38% of homeopathy trials decided, don't like the result, not going to publish. 53% of the published homeopathy trials were never registered. So for every one of those, there could be 50 trials where smoking hemlock didn't get a favorable outcome.
I wonder why that would happen. Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. Oh yeah, disclaimer, it's poison. You can die. Socrates died that way, I think he smoked.
Oh no.
This is so you can say 100% of published studies show.
Exactly. Well, there's one of the other things they point out too is like anytime, I don't know if they pointed that out in the study. But one of the things you should homeopathy, if it says this product cures X, Y, and Z, and that's probably homeopathy. It's probably not true. Most actual products that we use to treat symptoms. There's very few cures for anything in this world. Just note, if you see cure on a packaging, might want to take another look at it. Anyway, where was I? Okay, so of the trials that were published, and there's some percentage of the ones that were published also that did end up registering, but only after they published, which seems like you shouldn't be allowed to do it at that point. They can't. They then register after they published the study. They then said, "Oh, here's the registering the study we're going to do." Oh, by the way, we already did it though. Like it's not the right order. Of the trials that were registered and were published, some of which again were registered after they were published, 25% altered or changed completely the primary outcome in the published version.
Wow.
So, yeah. Primary outcome is basically you have to choose that ahead. It's like calling your shot in pool. It's
you say this is what we're going for. Yeah, this is what we're looking for. This is how we know our study is successful or our hypothesis is successful.
Exactly. So the idea is in the registered study, you've got your your primary outcome. You called your shot. That study is smoking hemlock to treat whooping cough. Primary outcome hypothesis being less coughing, and you might even define it by a number. 10 coughs per hour is bad. Less than 5 is good. 2 or less would be great in terms of your outcomes. And then you publish. And in the published version, it's 30 coughs per hour is bad. Less than 15 should be considered good. And 10 or less is great. Completely altering the goalpost. So that was in some of them. Or worse, they changed the primary outcome into something entirely different. And this is the sort of like, whooping cough study results in acne cure.
Right.
Or, like just something completely off target. They decided, oh no, that's now the point of the study.
Right.
And there's a homeopathy, even when they have a trial, even when they make a paper, is still not doing science. It's question though is as part of the segment. Did we really need a study for that? Homeopathy is already an unregulated, grifty feel to a kind of a business, and since those who believe in it tend not to trust science, a study by scientists about why you shouldn't trust homeopathy is a lot like singing at a choir.
I don't know. I still think it's helpful. I like to hear actual numbers, actual information about how much smoke and mirrors are involved with homeopathy. Just because, I mean, you're right. A lot of people who follow the teachings of homeopathic medicine don't want to hear from scientists. However, as is the case with many controversial topics related to science, they may be interested in having a debate or a conversation with someone that they know who is not a scientist. And so this is information that you could give to someone to bring up to a friend who maybe doesn't know that their homeopathy is not based in actual trials,
in reliable
There's
research.
Nobody,
yeah.
I think at that point there's nobody left in their social media feed. That's different.
So you have the conversation in person. I don't know. I think there are people out there who believe in homeopathic medicine who don't understand how separated from medical science it is. I do believe that is the case. There are people that don't know that.
Yep.
Okay. So actually, we did need this study then, because
I think we did.
That's how science works. It does the study. It doesn't just assume and guess things. And it's also, I think, important to note because homeopathic cures, at least from the study, were in 2018, so before the pandemic era, was a $5.5 billion US industry around the world. Which is why we have to get on board now. Every one of us, and everyone out there listening right now, you're on the first floor ground tier of a brand new triangle-shaped homeopathy campaign to study solarium-infused sugar pills. What you do is you take something with sugar in it, hold it into direct sunlight for a period of time, then eat it, and report back to us what it cured. We're going to publish
I love this study.
It's done.
Let's do this.
Oh, man.
Blair.
Yes.
You had some news.
Oh, yes, I have some good news.
Some good news?
But just Blairly.
Just Blairly.
This is Blair's segment in response to Justin's good news segment. This is the good news, but just Blairly segment.
Careful, because next week I'm going to have to come up with like a Justin's Animal Annex or Attic or something. It's gonna get
You'll never survive in there. So a half century of protection pays off for sea turtles. This is good news. At the Aldabra Atoll in the Seychelles, there has been a ban on turtle hunting since 1968. And since then, turtle numbers have skyrocketed. They have gone from about 2,000 to 3,000 eggs per year in the 1960s to more than 15,000 in the data collection period of 2014 to 2019. That's not individual eggs, clutches of eggs. Sea turtles lay hundreds of eggs in one sitting. So yes, that would have been bad. But anyway, so the egg numbers are skyrocketing since turtles have been taken off of the hunting kind of menu. And so this study demonstrates the importance of long-term monitoring. So it's not often the most glamorous part of research, but the long-term monitoring of something like this shows you what's working. And so it takes decades for a long-lived animal like a turtle to rebound after you illegalize hunting them. But it shows that commitment to that ban and to collecting the data afterwards can show the benefit to making these sorts of regulations. And so these Aldabra green turtles could be a conservation success story that we could use as a marker for future studies. The reason I say this is good news, but just Blairly, is that I want to remind everyone that turtles are in big trouble from climate change because of the fact that they have temperature dependent sex determination. So as the temperatures rise, there are more and more, in most turtle species, more and more females, which means if you have an unequal percentage, unless you're going to use parthenogenesis, you are not going to be able to see populations rising. So it's important to make these changes now before the animals have other issues that cause further problems. I always think about that. There was an episode, I'm sorry to go way pop culture on this, but there's an episode of The Simpsons where they were talking to Mr. Burns about how he had so many diseases that all of them were like caught in a doorway, and so none of them could get through, and it was a perfect balance. But we just need to make sure that it's not too many. So if there's one too many, then it would be a huge problem. But anyway, sea turtles, they're being hit by the plastic pollution, the climate change, and hunting and poaching.
And if a location like an atoll is where they lay their eggs, by sea level change as well.
Yes.
So don't forget that also.
Yes. But yeah, so the good news here is we have the opportunity to give animals in danger a head start before some of these larger issues start to impact them. So a lot of animals are adaptable to 1 or 2 threats, but you throw 5 at them and their population starts to collapse. So this is an example of a ban working, populations rising, and perhaps they will be able to rise to the occasion when other threats come by.
It's a good place to start. Yes. It's good news. It is. And yeah, not just Blairly. It's good news. I'll just take that as a piece of hope. Not just for sea turtles, but for other animals on the brink. And just really quickly, as a brief, let you know some other cool scientific discoveries that are going on. Published in Nature Genetics this last week, researchers have published their study, Systematic Reconstruction of Cellular Trajectories Across Mouse Embryos. So I talked about the egg being turned into an embryo earlier, but there's a lot of proliferation and diversification that goes on in that process between the blastocytes to turning into an actual embryo and then into an actual organism. So what happens to the instructions that take cells and turn them into the various types of cells they're going to be? Researchers have created kind of maps of this kind of cellular transformation in other species before, like in C. elegans, in worms, in zebrafish. So in very simple organisms that don't have a lot of tissues to diversify into. And so these researchers are really starting to look at some very complicated mapping of tissues, of genetic instructions, of mRNA that's involved, of the genes that are involved in turning different tissues into other tissues. And they're creating this really amazing map of the tissue change that is just the very beginning. It's scratching the surface of being able to follow a tissue or a particular cell from its very initiation to where it ends up in the end organism. So they've mapped a bunch of different pathways, and I think it's very cool. And the maps remind me somewhat of subway maps. these cells are taking their trip and they're going to wind up wherever they end up in the final organism. But this is new information that is, once again, very important for our understanding of development of different organ systems, of whole organisms, of being able to treat diseases, for understanding if something goes wrong at a crucial point in the cell division process. How is it going to affect tissues downstream? What kind of markers, targets therapeutically need to be approached in order to prevent disease or to fix disease? Um, and I'm not going to say cure because I know Justin will yell at me for that one. But but
Prevent.
prevent, yes. Yeah, but I find it a very interesting, exciting study, and it is in Nature Genetics, and you can read it if you want to. Pretty cool study. Oh my goodness. This is This Week in Science. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of this science talk show. We're talking about all the science that we enjoy learning about, and we hope that you enjoy learning about it too. You want to share some of this science with a friend? Oh, yes. We are your water cooler. Share it with a friend today. All right. This Week in Science, we've got some very quick COVID update news. Just want to report, as Blair was saying earlier, that you've been listening to the radio every day this week and nobody's talking about COVID anymore. And the reality is, COVID's still with us. We just want to pretend that it's not, and we love having a distraction that is, terrible in its own right, with lots of terrible things going on in the world right now. And there's a lot to pay attention to. So, just so you know, several European countries are seeing increases in COVID-19 cases and hospitalizations. And it seems as though the gap between case numbers rising and hospitalization numbers rising is even less than it used to be. So it's much, much more tied together, more in time. The reasoning for this is, so far they think it is an increase in the Omicron variant BA2. And in some cases, up to 75% of new cases are this Omicron variant, which is thought to be, not shown definitively, but because it is spreading so much more rapidly, seems to be supported that it is more transmissible than the original Omicron variant, even. And yeah, so what does this mean for COVID generally? Well, Blair, what have you seen doctors like Jeremy Faust saying?
Oh, saying to buy rapid tests and N95s.
Yeah. So people we trust are starting to say that, just be ready. We put our masks down temporarily. And like we said last week, our behavior is the thing that controls the spread of these viruses. And so your N95s, your KN95s are going to be your best protection, well fitted, of course, if you can get them that way. And any mask is better than no mask, certainly. And along those news, a study has come out looking at school mask mandates during the Delta variant period of time. They found that mandatory masking in schools during the Delta spread lowered transmission of the Delta variant by 72%.
What?
Yes. And now, with the increase in vaccination with the 5 to 12-year-old age range, and also in the spread of Omicron, researchers did say with the beginning of Omicron, the students that they're tracking, they've got tens of thousands of students and staff across 9 states, 61 districts answering the call. But they said that even short periods of mask removal, like lunchtime, result in higher transmission. Also, during the Delta wave, they're going to keep collecting data from schools, and they said that it's a discussion that we need to be having. They have created also, so if you know people in the school system, the researchers who have published this study looking at mask mandates in schools, they've created a tool for schools to use called Masking and Mitigation Considerations Calculator. It allows administrators to input their community COVID-19 rates of spread and determine how masking decisions in schools will affect case numbers, because it was shown that case numbers in schools do affect community spread. Not massively, but by about 10%. So masking in schools can reduce community case numbers, can reduce spread, etc.
So, Kiki, can I ask you a question about BA2?
Sure.
So it seems like a lot of the United States got Omicron. Like a lot.
Yes. Yeah.
If they got BA1 of Omicron, are they protected from BA2 or do we not know?
We don't know. We don't know.
And-
And it also depends on the timing. It depends on the timing. So when you were infected could also impact it as well. So we don't know.
Well, our booster numbers are bad. So if you haven't gotten your booster, please go get it. Boosters are now everyone 12 and older are eligible for boosters now, depending on how long it's been since your second dose or your final dose.
And something that was brought up on a political aspect of as politicians decide that the pandemic is over, what that means is that they will let emergency regulations lapse. And some of those emergency regulations aren't the regulations that mandate masks or close businesses. Some of them are emergency regulations that allow for free health insurance. So vaccines, boosters, the treatment if you are intubated in the hospital for COVID-19, a lot of these things will not be covered anymore as soon as the emergency regulations lapse. And here in the United States, that could mean even less uptake of boosters and vaccines. And so this is just something. The things that you don't know are important or you don't think of.
I wondered if there was something that wasn't being talked about widely in the press a few weeks ago because California brought back supplemental paid sick leave as Omicron was kind of like dying down. And there was a part of me that was wondering, is there something going on here? Do they know something we don't know?
It's very possible.
California does have a tendency to create patchwork in state legislation to cover what the federal government lets lapse.
Yeah.
So yeah, there might be a little of that. Hey, but before we think that this is over, Obama just got COVID. Like,
well, the Queen got COVID last week, right?
The Queen got COVID the week before. Like, it's still like there's still like a famous person list you can run through of who hasn't gotten it yet, kind of a thing. At this point,
I know Tom Hanks isn't on that list.
No,
because he died. He was like the first death from it. Right?
No. How dare you say that about America's sweetheart?
This is This Week in Science. Thank you so much for joining us for another episode. If you do enjoy the show, please head over to TWIS.org and click on that Patreon link and help support the show moving forward. $10 and more a month. We're going to thank you by name at the end of the show. Help produce the show and keep this show going. We appreciate your support. We really can't do this show without you. All right, let's come on back with that part of the show that you know and love as Blair's Animal Corner.
With Blair.
She loves our creatures, great and small. Biped, millipede, no pet at all. If you want to hear about animals, she's your girl. Except for giant pandas and squirrels.
Stop, Blair!
That was me running to the animal corner.
Run to your corner, Blair.
Okay, so,
run to your corner.
Right. My first story is an amazing story, one of my favorites of the year so far, I think. It is about smelly birds.
Birds aren't smelly.
Well,
they preen all the time.
It turns out, Kiki, perhaps they are. So,
actually, they are. Anyone who owns birds knows they stink.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes, it's true. So we have so many times on this show talked about the fact that you were told for so long. I was told when I worked at a zoo as a teen that most birds have no sense of smell. This is something that was considered kind of scientific consensus for so long. And then what happened, Kiki?
They found the part of the brain that handles...
They found it. Ha, ha, ha. They realized they'd been throwing it away.
Yes.
The olfactory bulb.
Yes. So they can smell. Birds can smell. Get out of here. Well, anyway, so that has opened this whole field of research where there had not historically been research on smell, olfactory communication between birds, anything related to smell, and kind of any sort of strategy or social structure, or anything relating to smell in birds, because if they couldn't smell, why would they do these things, right? And so in recent years there have been papers coming out looking at smell and birds and how they might be using it, and all of these kinds of things that we've been neglecting the whole time. It was assumed that they just didn't have the capability to smell. So the latest, this one, this piece of research from Bielefeld University is looking at their uropygial or preen gland. And the preen gland secretes an oil that birds spread on their feathers. They do this several times a day. Throughout the day, they're preening themselves, as Kiki mentioned. They're keeping their feathers all nice. And that oil, for a long time, was thought to just help with kind of removal of dirt or mites, and also helping to make their feathers hydrophobic. So if it rained on these birds, the water would just kind of roll off their back. So if you see like water off a duck's back, right, that's partially because of the oil that they are spreading over their feathers. And so we know all of these functions of the preen gland, and that was enough for a long time, but it turns out there might be others. And this all comes from a review of 187 studies. 55 of them investigated preen oil composition, and researchers found that there were differences among them. So the actual molecules in the preen oil differed between the sexes in half of the studies that they looked at, and it varied seasonally. So this could mean one of several things. One, it could be camouflage based. They could be using it to kind of hide their presence from predators. This could make sense seasonally because the seasons when this thing changed usually had to do with breeding season, and therefore it could be related to when they were sitting on eggs, protecting their eggs. They can't run away when a predator comes by, so they have to hide. They have to hide visually. They also might be hiding smellily.
Yeah, that's
olfactorily.
That's a huge thing that humans don't really think about. When we think about hiding, we're like duck behind a thing. Good.
I tried to hide an entire train car with smelly socks once.
As a child?
No, it
Say
was
this
while
again.
backpacking. While backpacking across Europe, we got a train car, my partner and I at the time, and we wanted the full bench to sleep on, and we didn't want to
I
have to
see.
share the train car. So we hadn't done laundry, so I hung our stinky socks up right over the door. And people would open the door and then close it very quickly.
I see. So that's almost an offensive maneuver related to
Most
smell.
definitely offensive.
Yes. As opposed to a defensive maneuver where you want to blend in with your environment, right? But the other possibility is, again, because this often related to breeding season, this could be a chemical signal. It could be related to attracting a mate. It could be about whether you smell good. It could also be that there are cues to the genetics of the individual with that. So the whole the t-shirt test, right? You think that somebody smells good after a workout because they are genetically dissimilar from you and therefore have good genes for recombination into offspring, right? And so there could be something about that here as well. So there's 3 different hypotheses here about what could be going on. But there needs to be some study. This was just looking at past studies on compositions of the preen oil. So now it's time to move forward. It's time to look at taking samples during breeding season, record them during the different breeding stages, record how preen oil differs or is similar between successful and unsuccessful individuals. Look at whether the preen oil composition is passed down to offspring. Is it genetic? Also, look at things besides shorebirds. So a lot of the ones who had this seasonal change were shorebirds who nest on the ground, who are way more likely to get predated upon than birds who nest in a tree. So do birds that are less likely to be predated upon have the same changes in their preen oil? So it's just, this opens a whole new field of research.
Which previously would never have been considered.
Yeah, because birds can't smell or something.
They can't smell. Why would they be smelling each other?
I'm gonna
love it.
I'm gonna have to do the joke that was posted in the chat room here by Kevin Reardon. Three birds are sitting on a wire. First bird says, "My instinct says we should fly south." Second bird says, "My instinct says we should fly north." Third bird says, "My instincts too, but I have no idea where to fly." I like it. So there's a story I didn't bring out of UC Davis this week that was looking at redwood trees. And they discovered
the leaves.
Redwood trees have two distinct types of leaves. One that's focused on photosynthesis, and the other is dedicated to absorbing water.
Right.
And can like take in something crazy like 14 gallons of water in a day or something just through this other leaf that there's hundreds of thousands of on the tree. But it's fascinating because we've studied redwood trees. We've
so
been
long.
around redwood trees.
Yeah.
And I guess people looked at the other kind of funky looking leaf and just thought it was a malformed leaf. Like a leaf that hadn't opened for some reason, because it's just sort of tubular as it sticks out. They also noticed, I'm sort of redoing the story a little bit, even though it's not here. They also noticed that they have different oil or waxy coverings depending on their use, depending on their climate, and that depending on where they are. If they're in a wetter climate, those tubular ones are towards the bottom. No, towards the top. Towards the bottom. So they can collect water
They can hold the water as opposed to the evapotranspiration.
And the photosynthesis leaves tends to be towards the top of the canopy.
That makes
sense. When it reverses in places where it's not rainy but foggy, then the tubular ones are pulling water out of the top of the tree. And you can actually tell the climate that tree is supposed to be in based on where those leaves are. And something about they can actually just by looking at the type of waxy residue on the leaves determine what sort of climate it's fighting to survive in, because that also changes whether it's repelling to get photosynthesis or whether that it's absorbing water.
Right.
So really fascinating thing, but that's another example of like redwood trees, the biggest, oldest tree that's ever been. We've studied them in the Pacific Northwest. People have been studying these trees for years and years and years, and just completely wrote off one of the two types of leaves on the tree. Just ignored it. So, great job, UC Davis, for...
Go Davis! Go Aggies! Go Mustangs! I don't even know what your thing is anymore.
It's the
Blair.
Aggies. It's like a horse.
I don't know what it is, but...
Agriculture? But they have a horse.
I went there. I don't know. I don't do the sports. I just did the science. Blair, you had one more animal corner.
Yeah. So another kind of area of study that I always like to bring to the show is related to preventing poaching. And I talked about poaching a little bit with the turtles already. But I keep bringing it back to elephants because they are one of the most highly poached animals on the planet. Pangolin is the most poached mammal, but elephants pretty high. As I say over and over, 96 elephants a day are killed for their ivory. Insane. Yeah. And so any way that we can cut off the ivory supply at the source is going to help. This is part of the problem, right? Is if you illegalize selling the stuff, but you can't stop them from hunting it, then people will still buy it illegally. You have to stop it at the source. So how can you do that? And so in recent years, there have been explorations into DNA testing to try to figure out how to prevent poaching. Well, how does that work? In a University of Washington project, the researchers wanted to find a way to use DNA testing on elephant ivory to identify where the tusks came from and which ivory is related to which after
this
being
is
sold.
fascinating. They were able to track smuggling networks based on the genetics of that they pulled from the ivory.
Right. So they looked at dozens of different ivory seizures, and they found that the majority of smuggled ivory and the connections between those networks are pretty. They're narrowed down to a very specific area. So they were able to see connections between ivory seizures across continents, kind of narrow it down to which port it came out of and which ivory samples are related, siblings, cousins, etc. Because if they're closely related, then they probably came from the same area. So then from there, they can figure out not only which port it came from, but where in Africa likely that these tusks came from. They found that the majority of the networks behind large ivory shipments were from ports in Kenya, Uganda, and Nigeria. So already figuring that out, you can push the majority of your resources to checking shipments from those ports. Already, that is extremely helpful. Yep. They looked at 4,300 tusks from both forest and savanna elephants collected from 49 separate shipments in 12 different African nations between 2002 and 2019. And they found that most of them were related. So they were all coming from these 3 ports, and a lot of them were related. They were all coming back to the same populations year after year to get their ivory. So not only do you know which ports the ivory is coming out of, but you know which populations of elephants they keep targeting.
Being predated on, yeah.
Yeah, so now you know who to protect. So it helps you figure out where to search, but also which individual elephants to put your resources into to prevent poaching. So they're also now the next step of this center's projects is to try to address this by training dogs to sniff for contraband at these ports without having to open shipping containers. They would blow air from the shipping container through odor collection pads, and then the dogs would smell the pads. So they hope that this screening method would then be able to be used to detect illegal wildlife contraband, timber species, etc. So they're using all these different things together, but I think what I wanted to bring here was the idea that poachers are going back to the same populations of elephants over and over and over. They find a source, they're going to keep using it, because if you think about if I was a poacher, I would not want to spend days, weeks, months finding another herd of elephants if I know where one herd is and what their patterns are over generations.
Yeah.
And I know how to get individual elephants out of that and get their ivory. So
that, and then I back of my mind, I would suspect that there's perhaps a little bit of what would you call it? Bureaucratic cover. Like I would also want to sort of interrogate the local authorities of whatever reason that is, to see if there's a corruption thing taking place, because it also, aside from knowing where the population is, there's would seem
there
to be
are
a
routes,
sense of
there are people
safety.
involved.
Yeah. They know what their path of least resistance is. Totally. So that's right. So perhaps these ports are not doing as good of a job of screening things, intentionally, or just because they don't have the right resources, who knows. But then CITES can go in there and bring in their own kind of inspection forces to protect these animals. So cool. I really like the idea of using DNA to track down the elephants that need the most protections and the places where these items are being sent through.
I love it. Yes. Use the DNA to our advantage.
That's right.
Yeah. Thank you. Justin, You're going to follow this up with some hot science.
Oh gosh, let me get
You're
this.
so hot, you're on fire.
Yeah, fire bad. Fire
Yes,
very, very
okay.
bad. Fires have gotten larger and more frequent and more widespread across the United States since the year 2000, according to a new University of Colorado Boulder led paper. So we kind of know, like, this, like, it seems that way. Every fire season seems to be like the most horrific fire season that we've ever seen. This is an actual published study in Science Advances. Paper shows that large fires have not only become more common, they are also spreading into new areas, impacting land that previously did not burn. To evaluate how the size, frequency, and extent of fires have changed in the United States, researchers analyzed data from over 28,000 fires that occurred between 1984 and 2018 from the Monitoring Trends and Burn Severity database, which says it combines satellite imagery with the best available state and federal fire history records to give a picture of fire trends. The team found that there were more fires across all regions in the contiguous United States in 2005 to 2018 compared to the previous 2 decades. So this isn't just in the West. This is everywhere. In the West and in the East, fire frequency doubled. So if you were feeling like there was more fires in the fire season than when you were a child in those areas, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. It's twice as much. In the Great Plains, which you don't really think anything, tornadoes, floods, that's about it in the Great Plains, right? Fire frequency quadrupled. They have 4 times as many fires breaking out in the Great Plains regions in the United States. So as a result, the amount of land burned each year increased from a median of 1,500 to, it was 1,500 square miles in the West. It is now 5,500 square miles in fire season. And it went from 465 square miles of the Great Plains to 1,295. So that's quite a bit.
It's a lot.
Researchers also took a closer look at the most extreme fire events in each region. They found that in the West and the Great Plains, the largest wildfires grew bigger and ignited more often in the 2000s than they had in the decades previously. Throughout the record, large fires were more likely to occur around the same time as other large fires. So a large fire by itself taxes the crews whose job it is to mitigate those fires. So having frequency of large fires occurring simultaneously is just devastating to your ability to fight them. Finally, the team discovered that the size of fire-prone areas increased in all regions of the contiguous United States in the 2000s, meaning that not only is the distance between individual fires getting smaller than it was in the previous decades, but that fire is spreading into areas that didn't used to encounter burn seasons.
Right. Places that you'd think would not be burned are now burning.
Yeah. So unfortunately, they say the results align with other troubling risk trends, such as the fact that development in natural hazard zones, so new housing is going up in places that were like, oh yeah, that forest burns every couple of years. So instead, they cut down the trees or whatever and started building houses there. Yeah, that's also
because it makes
helping.
so much sense.
Yeah.
We got to put the people somewhere. Where are we going to put the people?
I'm telling you, if you love nature, people, and
stay
I know
out of
you
it.
do. I know you all do.
Yep.
Yeah, move to the biggest urban developed density city that you can find, and stay away from it. Get as far away from nature. You can go visit, and it'll still be there if you do that. But if you move into it, it's not nature anymore. It stops being nature. and then you've removed the nature from.
Well, you have two. I feel like you have lots of people, but you have two big different groups moving into natural spaces. You have wealthy people who want to live in nature because it's cush and it's nice, and they get a giant house and
Lots of
etc.
land, and it keeps you
Yeah.
away from all the people in the very dense urban places.
Yeah. There's also people who can't afford to live where they work and get pushed into rural areas.
Yeah,
So-
but
and-
you think rural areas is everything outside of the Bay Area, which is still cities. It's still, we have running water, we have city services.
Justin, the Santa Cruz Mountains burned. That's Bay Area. Those are people who commute
Yeah,
to
but
San
have you
Jose.
been to Santa Cruz Mountains? That is like mountain lion territory. That's the only thing that really that uses that.
No,
Raccoons and mountain lions.
humans live there. That's what I'm talking
People
about.
live
That's
there.
people who have gotten priced out of living in San Jose live in the Santa Cruz Mountains. That is a thing. So that's all I'm saying is that there is an, just like with other climate change issues, there
Are
is a
they in
disproportionate
houses?
level.
But this, okay,
Are
this is
they in houses, or
tangential.
are they
This
just
is all,
wandering. Okay, sorry. Yeah,
this is all
okay.
tangential. Yeah.
Of course it is. This is part of
Yeah.
it. So anyway, my last story of the night: fire good.
Oh, really?
Yeah, that was fire bad, and this is fire good. So yeah, this is a study titled "How Indigenous Burning Shaped the Klamath Forest for Millennia." It's published in Journal Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. A UC Berkeley study combines scientific data with indigenous oral histories and ecological knowledge to show that the cultural burnings practices of the native people in the Klamath Mountains, the Karuk and Yurok tribes, helped shape the region's forests for about 1,000 years before the European colonization made it out west. So the study found the forest biomass in the region used to be approximately half what it is now, and that cultural burnings by the tribes played a significant role in maintaining the forest structure and biodiversity, even during periods of climate variability. In fact, that's actually part of how they were able to suss that it was man-made fires. Looking back through the records, they looked back through some soil cores in lakes, and they could see by pollen counts diversity of fauna that they were there, and by charcoal layers they could see when there was big fires there. And they found that during wet seasons there were actually sometimes more fires because the wet seasons would aggregate more growth to the forest floor, and then they would need to be burned sooner than in dry seasons. This is also linked to a recent study in Sierra Nevada found that density of trees in that region had increased dramatically over the past century by a factor of 6 to 7 fold. 6 or 7 times the amount of density of trees than there had been previously, which is also contributing to more. We had some really severe, like South Lake Tahoe almost caught fire.
Right.
So much of the Sierras was ablaze in the past year. Study focused
And there
on
was also the Rocky Mountains. So outside Colorado, the lands in the middle of winter, in the middle of December, wet, snowy season, and they had a massive, massive fire.
Yeah, so
Things
to
you don't
estimate
see.
how the forest biomass near the lakes had changed, because they went to a couple of these fish lakes, they did the pollen grains and sediment level core samples to sort of research the past to get a glimpse of it. Says co-author Frank Lake, research ecologist of the U.S. Forest Service and a Karuk descendant growing up among Karuk and Yurok tribes. In many cases, the ethnographic information actually helped explain both the geographic and temporal patterns in the fire history records. For example, fire scars found near the lakes suggested that fires occurred more often near Fish Lake than Lake Ogeramtok, can't pronounce it, sorry, which is consistent with accounts that the areas and lakes were used for different tribal purposes. In addition,
Right.
patterns in fire frequency and fire and forest biomass during the cool, wet Little Ice Age also indicated a significant human influence on the forest. This is quoting one of the researchers, if you're trying to detect a signal of induced fire due to human stewardship, having a cooler, wetter climate is a perfect time to do so because it will really stand out in the record. And that's exactly what we found. More charcoal accumulation, more charcoal production, so therefore more fires and decreases in biomass that correspond with that fire. And for those who aren't familiar, Native American controlled burns were just common out west. That was the practice of the native peoples.
Common
of
across the
California.
United States, common across North America, really.
Yeah. So then,
It
right, and
wasn't
then
an
it was
Indian
outlawed.
practice.
It was
Yeah.
outlawed by the invading, post-European populations. So those two studies, just kind of brought those out there too, because the first one that's mentioning how fires are just getting worse everywhere doesn't mention the fact that for 1,000 years there was stewardship taking place. The second one does focus on that, thankfully. But yeah, it's getting worse.
The stewardship was definitely a part, and we didn't know how to manage, and we thought our way was better, and we didn't do it correctly. And I remember the interview that we had written about the tree rings. The woman who wrote a book about tree rings, the dendrochronology, and how she found that there were in the tree rings burn scars, and those burn scars went back, and some of these trees were super old, and then it's these major fires that have started burning, these super fires that have started happening that actually take the trees out, and but these trees actually have scars within themselves that go back hundreds of years, not hundreds and hundreds, but go back decades.
They can't. I mean, if you're
Yeah.
talking about a redwood, which is a very fire resistant tree, I mean, it can handle fire, and
It likes fire. It's
to
good for the
it loves
seeds.
the fire. This is
Yeah.
how we get more trees. Yeah, then you could be talking about a record that goes back,
Yeah.
1,000 years. Really, you
Yeah.
could be or further. You really can. You really can get some history out of that old growth.
Yeah.
So I think the good news is here there's more and more research related to this happening, and there's also more and more efforts to reconnect to the native peoples, especially in wilderness areas, national parks, state parks, county parks. And so there is an effort right now to try to build these partnerships, learn from the people who were the real stewards of this land before us, and try to grow through that and start to take those lessons to heart.
Well, it's
And I
also
would
we have to get past the damage that we've done already
Mhm.
by allowing the understory to grow to such a point that you have these major fires that we now have to deal with across millions of acres of land. And now we have to figure out how to get past that to get it back to a place where it's sustainable, because that's part of the problem. And climate change is compounding that.
Mhm.
So it's a
Absolutely.
number of issues. Yeah.
And climate change is a tricky one too, because we like the idea of forests being a carbon sink. And so you think more forest, the better, the denser, the better. And then having to burn it to manage it sounds like you're working in the wrong direction. So that's really tough. But I would just like to point out the people who managed before are still here. Maybe the solution is to transfer the land back to those people who managed it for thousands of years
Before.
and
Yeah.
and make it
And that's happening in some
their
cases.
land.
Yeah.
Yep. These kinds of things are starting to
Like,
happen, and it's
Mhm.
promising. But like you said, Justin, there's actually, I was looking for the link to your story, and there's another story out of Oregon State University. This is huge forest fires that don't kill the living trees, don't release as much carbon as we think they do into the atmosphere. So the trees that burn, yes, they're releasing biomass, they're releasing
Yeah.
carbon into the atmosphere, but the ones that survive, they're keeping the carbon. So it's not, they said that in this paper in forests, they discovered that the estimates of how much carbon dioxide was being released into the atmosphere didn't match with what they were actually seeing. And so they did this study and they discovered that, lo and behold, living trees hold on to their carbon, which is
Yeah, and you're also the sprinting growth because you've made the forest more open, so there's more new growth, which is actually taking down carbons quicker. Also, one of the interesting things is
putting it in the ground.
I guess it's part of the one of the other things they found in the indigenous controlled burn story was that you end up with more fast burn because you were talking about the scarrings. When you do controlled burnings, you end up with a forest that is made up of those more fire resistant hardwoods. And so that when the lightning strike thing happens, it's not in a fast burning wood scenario, it's also in a fire resistant tree environment. And so you don't get those out of control fires that are taking place today. It's if you do the controlled one, you don't have the out of control one later. So fire good, fire bad.
This Week in Science, good.
Good.
I'm just going to keep it there. This Week in Science, good. We hope you're enjoying this show. I have a couple more stories here. Let's talk about brains. We've talked about the slow brains, forests, trees. Those are the slow brains on the planet. Let's talk about fast electrical brains and how do mice, how do we know what's going on in the world? So one thing about mice, very interesting, we didn't know previously whether or not they could look at a picture of an object and transfer that to a memory or a recognition of a real world object. So say you see a picture of a chair and then you come to a chair. As a person, you go, "Oh, I saw a chair in that picture. That looks exactly it's a chair. It's the same thing." And so you can transfer information gained from a two-dimensional symbol or representation of something in the real world. You can transfer that to three-dimensional and vice versa. You can take your three-dimensional world stuff and stick it in 2 dimensions, and we are fine with all of this. And part of the brain that's involved in navigating this transfer of information between multiple dimensions is the hippocampus. Hippocampus of the brain is also part of navigation, allowing us to understand where we are in space. It's also involved in creating memories. Very important area of the brain for so many reasons. Well, researchers wanted to find out what other animals out there can actually take this transference and make it work. They'd never tried it on mice before. And so they said, "Hey, let's do this. Let's put mice in a situation where we measure from their brains, we're going to measure their hippocampus, and we're also going to give them pictures of things, and then we're going to test them on the real things." And lo and behold, dun, 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 the hippocampus definitely involved when they used a sedative in the brain injected directly into the hippocampus, muscimol. It reduced activity of the hippocampus and it reduced the ability of mice to be able to make this transference from two-dimensional to three-dimensional. But in just the general knowledge, which is very interesting, these mice were able to just look at pictures and recognize objects in the real world. So look at pictures within a sample area, and then when the pictures were replaced with three-dimensional objects, they recognize them. How'd they know they recognized them? Well, novelty is interesting. And so the picture that had been replaced with an object they had never seen before was the object that was investigated the most. The mice ignored the object that they had seen in the picture because it wasn't novel. So this is kind of a correlation. The way that we can get an idea that they're really making this transference from 2D to 3D is the fact that the hippocampus seemed to activate in the appropriate manner, the way that we know that human hippocampus activates. But I don't know, it's very interesting. This question of, you look at a picture on the wall and you're able to know, oh, it's my family. and you can have memories associated with it. There's a lot of stuff we associate with pictures, with symbols. And it's interesting to know that another mammal who doesn't have any reason to use pictures can still transfer a picture to an object.
This test design is tough. I have a suggestion for another experiment.
Okay.
So you train them you give them like 2 or 3 different objects, and you train them to pick a particular one to get a treat. And then you replace them all with pictures. And vice versa.
Mm-hmm.
Do they pick the picture of the thing for the treat?
You have to make sure that they're not just learning about where the treats are, right? You have to like carefully
but
balance it so that
they'd be
there's not always
associating
treats
it
there, and yeah.
right? Like if I had a glove, a thumbtack, and a post-it note, and if every time they walked over to the glove they got a treat, and then I had pictures of a glove and a thumbtack and a post-it note,
Right.
and then they went to the picture of the glove and got a treat, right? That would mean they think it's the same thing.
As long as it's not in the same location, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
See,
Yeah.
I question whether or not this is actually showing that they can't distinguish between 2D and 3. Look, if I had a picture on my wall of the Mona Lisa that I walked by on a daily basis, and then walking by and there's a woman who looks very much like the Mona Lisa standing there, I would be very much intrigued and think that was very novel, right? As opposed to somebody else saying that, right? Like that, like I don't know. I think that would be a little bit more like I've identified that it was 2-dimensional. I get the kind of familiarization thing of the image replaced by the object, but I guess I don't know if that's doing a distinguishing thing. To me, it almost sounds like they couldn't really.
Well, I mean, they could tell that the object in the picture was the same as the 3-dimensional object in their room, and
but weren't it all
they
freaked out about the fact that the 2-dimensional object is just poofed into 3 dimensions?
suddenly turned.
That would be how did that happen? Would be the first thing you'd want to investigate.
It's the real Mona Lisa.
Yeah, what's she doing here?
That's actually a very funny point. The big thing here is that if this study is actually determining this concept of 2D to 3D transference and conceptual, I guess, grokking or judging, then what it means is that mice have this capability that's really only previously been seen in primates. So maybe Douglas Adams was right. Maybe we just need to be looking at the mice a lot more. Another study in mice, because researchers love mice so much. They want to solve all the problems and cure all the things in mice. Researchers at the Salk Institute wanted to understand how we navigate social situations and how our brain identifies social rank. And an example that is given is, say you have a pizza and there's a pizza on the table. If you go into the room and your 7-year-old niece is in the room going for the pizza, and your boss is in the room going for the pizza, you're very likely to jump in and snag a piece of pizza before your niece takes it, because you're like, niece, whatever, I'm gonna eat that pizza. But you will recognize that your boss is your boss, and maybe you'll let your boss have that slice of pizza and go get that pizza before you. I mean, it could be very different depending on you.
What a jerk aunt or uncle. What? Gosh.
But we have these social situations all the time, and mammals live in these social environments, and we figure out how to navigate social hierarchies and situations, and it's not always the same situation. And they just published a paper in Nature in which they looked at the brain and a particular area of the brain called the medial prefrontal cortex, and determined how it was involved in the mice representing social rank in their situations. So they put mice in social groups of about 4 to 6 mice. And then in those social groups, they let them kind of get used to each other. And then they made them kind of like round robin compete to get food. And they'd put one mouse up against another mouse. And while had mouse versus mouse, they while they were doing this, they were recording with wireless brain recordings from the medial prefrontal cortex to see what kind of signals were happening. And what they found is that they could predict with like 95% accuracy, super high accuracy, based on the activity in the prefrontal cortex, how an individual mouse was going to behave in the situation. And it came down to not necessarily the actual social hierarchies, but it came down to a particular mindset. And they're calling it the winning mindset. So even subordinate animals with particular signature of activity in their medial prefrontal cortex would go in there and take food the
Huh.
more dominant mouse would, and they could predict it based on how active this area of the brain was. And so they're talking about this area of the brain. If you're going into a social situation and you're like feeling down on yourself or you're like, oh, whatever, you're already getting yourself out of that winning mindset. You have
Hmm.
your activity in that medial prefrontal cortex going.
So be assertive, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah,
Just be
yeah,
assertive.
maybe it's
It's actually, and it's interesting in what we conceive of as a non-conscious species of mouse that wouldn't necessarily say, "Oh, you're my boss, you're dominant, whatever." It's those amorphous social situations where even maybe you're kind of on even footing, but some days you're not feeling it, or other days you're feeling it more, and it it comes through in your brain activity. What were you gonna say,
Yeah.
Justin?
well, I was gonna say like whatever that is. Like, I wonder if it would register when because I feel like I just always take the piece of pizza, but not because of a winning attitude, not because of just because I wouldn't think about the other
You wouldn't
person.
even be noticing it. It's not on
No,
your radar.
it's just weird. Like, I feel like this is also like the history of all the problems I've had at workplaces over the years too with bosses. Like, I don't get that part that that you wouldn't take the piece of pizza. Like, this is the boss. They probably provided the pizza, probably for the employees. That's why there's a pizza. What is he gonna eat? He's gonna provide pizza for the employees and then eat it all? No, that's for us anyway. Yeah, he's gonna go eat a fancy dinner later. He's the boss. My goodness.
Well, you're
I don't think I
definitely
would think
not
it. Like, I don't think there would
you're
be a
not in
register.
competition like the mice were.
No, I don't think it's a winning attitude. I feel like there's just some sort of path of least resistance in this universe that I'm walking through. I would just take the piece of pizza without thinking about, and the niece too. Not because I'm trying to beat the niece to the pizza,
You're
but
just not
it's just
thinking
like,
about it.
oh, you should be faster, learn reflexes.
So yeah, so is it winning or is it not being able to read social situations?
I think it's not caring.
But so
I think it's not caring.
yeah, so it's gotta be
And I
it's
might
gotta
have
be
been.
some combination though. That's interesting is, this is internal to the mice. And, like I said, there's there is in normal situations, you would expect subservient mice to always let a dominant mouse win. But they said there are lots of situations in which the subservient mice did not. They would actually go get the food first. And so what is it about that? They're more hungry. They've probably all been without food for the same amount of time. What is it that changes to create the signal that their computer program could see, would predict that subservient mouse was going to go get the food and win the food out over the dominant mouse? Like, what is it?
and
And so
and
I bet the same signal is
yeah.
happening in your brain.
I want to know what the kind of long-term success of these mice would be, because on the one hand you
Mm.
have better access to food because of the winning attitude, but on the
Right.
other hand, do you have um, a situation where their dynamic within their social group reflects this, where there's maybe not as much give and take or as much care given to this individual, right? So this is the thing I'd be interested about, is the long-term impact. If they keep ignoring social cues and taking food and, pissing off other mice or rats, does that
They probably
impact,
get leadership. We could get roles in management, mouse management roles.
does
Very
it, or
soon.
does it mean they get kicked out when there's communal food and they don't get told, right? So
Yeah.
I think that would be it.
Could do
Because
that.
otherwise, why evolutionarily, why wouldn't they just all move this way?
So, but there is a diversity in it, and and you culturally, if I was thinking about it, I don't know why I've got this picture of some meeting with a business group of Japanese businessmen who were negotiating for something, and you could see there was the guy with seniority on their side of the table, and if he nodded, it was like a chain event of everybody who was. Then the guy under him nodded, and then the guy under him nodded. It was like it was like a wave that went down this side of the table, and it's just sort of the picture. Like, I think there's also a societal thing where people in some societies or cultures might put greater deference or weight to a business structure or a caste system or a military hierarchy or that sort of thing. Um, so I wonder if because then I'm starting to think, is this a cultural affect and not a genetic affect? And
But it
therefore, if
would
we
be
saw
influenced.
a
Yeah,
different
it would
group
be
of mice,
influenced. Yeah. So this is, yeah, different groups of mice. This is a group, these are
yeah,
groups of mice who were allowed to live together for a period of time before this competition started. So they created their hierarchies, and uh they they created their little society, of their
yeah.
little tribe of mice.
But I
And
want to
then they were
social
put
engineer
head to
it.
head to compete. And so then if you then took those mice and put them with other mice and made them get it together and do it over again, would the same effect happen?
Right, but if
Would
you
the
trade
same
that,
mice have the same results?
if you had that other group doing collaboration type things for like right,
Instead of
the,
competition.
you
Yeah.
social engineer them differently to have them doing different like social tasks, or one's a more competitive task before they get into that environment, and then see if those differences were actually like a evolutionary genetic based thing, or if it was a learned sort of strategy, survival strategy.
Right. So yeah, is it instinct or is it learned? And
Yeah,
that's I think a very good question that they didn't answer, but with this they were able to tell that this area of the brain, activity in it, is indicative of social outcomes, of knowing, like, basically recognition of the hierarchical social status of the other individual in the situation, and then making a plan based on it. So this brain region can be used in mice, not in people. This isn't in people, but I mean we have that brain area. So hmm. And we're social. What does it mean? Nothing yet, but it's
Hmm.
interesting to think about. Sure is. And that's all I've got for science stories.
all right.
Yeah. Did we do it?
Did we
Did
do
we
it?
make it? Did we do it? Did we make it?
Mm-hmm.
I think we did.
Uh-huh.
A tight
We
120. Here we are.
woo. Yowza. Yowzas. We make it. We make it long. We make the science long and fun. So much fun. Thank you for listening, everyone. We hope that you enjoyed the show. I would love to shout out to people who help with show fodder. Thank you so much for social media and show notes, show descriptions. Very, very helpful. Gord and Arnlore and others who help to keep the chat rooms above board. Thank you for all of your help there. Rachel, thank you for your amazing editing and assistance. And Identity 4, thank you for recording the show. And additionally, I would love to thank our Patreon sponsors. Thank you to Richard Badge, Kent Northcote, Pierre Velazar, Ralphie Figueroa, John Ratnaswamy, Carl Kornfeld, Karen Tazi, Woody MS, Chris Wozniak, Dave Bunn, Vega Chefstad, Hal Snyder, Donathan Stiles, a.k.a. Don Stylo, John Lee, Ali Coffin, Maddie Perrin, Gaurav Sharma, Reagan, Don Mundis, Stephen Albaran, Dale Myshak, Stu Pollock, Andrew Swanson, Fredus104, Sky Luke, Paul Ronovich, Kevin Reardon, Noodles, Jack, Brian Carrington, Matt Bass, Sean and Nina Lamb, John McKee, Greg Riley, Mark Hassenflo, Gene Tellier, Steve Leisman, a.k.a. Zima, Ken Hayes, Harold Tan, Christopher Rappin, Dana Pearson, Richard Brendan Minish, Johnny Gridley, Rami Day, Flying Out, Christopher Dreyer, Artyom, Greg Briggs, John Atwood, Bob Coburn, Rudy Garcia, Dave Wilkinson, Rodney Lewis, Paul, Philip Shane, Kurt Larson, Craig Landon, Mountain Sloth, Jim Drapeau, Stu Doster, Jason Olds, Dave Neighbor, Eric Knapp, E.O., Kevin Parachan, Aaron Luthen, Steve DeBell, Bob Calder, Marjorie, Paul Disney, David Simmerley, Patrick Pecoraro, Tony Steele, and Jason Roberts. Thank you for supporting TWIS on Patreon. And if any of you would like to support us on Patreon, head over to twis.org and click on the Patreon button. On next week's show,
we will be back broadcasting Wednesday, 8 p.m. Pacific time, or Thursday, 4 a.m. now, Central European time.
Surprise!
Broadcasting live from our YouTube and our Facebook channels and from twis.org/live.
Hey, do you want to listen to us as a podcast? Perhaps while you tend to your garden? Just search for This Week in Science if our podcasts are found. If you enjoyed the show, get your friends to subscribe as well.
For more information on anything you heard here today, show notes and links to stories will be available on our website, www.twis.org, where you can also sign up for a newsletter.
You can also contact us directly. Email Kirsten at thisweekinscience.com, Justin at twistminion@gmail.com, or me, Blair, at blairbaz@twis.org. Just be sure to put TWIS, TWIS, in the subject line, or your email will be spam filtered via a preening gland that covers up and camouflages the scent of said email, and we will never sniff it out.
Or you can hit us up on the Twitter, where we are at TWIScience, at Dr. Kiki, at Jackson Fly, and at Blair's Menagerie. We love your feedback. If there's a topic you'd like us to cover or address, a suggestion for an interview, a haiku that comes to you in the night, please let us know.
We'll be back here next week, and we hope you'll join us again for more great science news.
And if you've learned anything from the show, remember,
it's all in your head.
This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science, it's the end of the world. So I'm setting up shop, got my banner unfurled. It says the scientist is in, I'm gonna sell my advice. Show them how to stop the robots with a simple device. I'll reverse global warming with a wave of my hand. And all it'll cost you is a couple of grand. 'Cause this week's science is coming your way. So everybody listen to what I say. I use the scientific method for all that it's worth. And I'll broadcast my opinion all over the earth. 'Cause it's This Week in Science. This Week in Science. This Week in Science. 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 This Week in 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 Science.